I'm also very mindful that we are between you and dinner, and we're the last session before the end of the conference, so let me thank you as well for your willingness to stay with us. It's always a pleasure to follow EPEC, and she's one of my dear collaborators that I'm working with and says many things that means I don't have to say, so thank you very much, EPEC. I feel like I'm a little bit of an imposter here because while I started my career as an economist and intending to be in academia, I have a weird career where I've gone in and out of academia, policy circles, and civil society. So, and I've left theoretical economics behind a few years ago, but what's wonderful about being a feminist economist is that I can use it and bring it into the policy spaces that I work on. So I'm not just a thinker, I feel like I'm also a doer and hopefully an influencer. So, and being on the inside of a policy institution, as Torsten said, like an institution like the World Bank, which was not where I was at in the early 2000s. I was outside demonstrating against the World Bank for against structural adjustment and other things, and to my great surprise, I accepted a job there 25 years later. In fact, I have an anecdote where I was asked, have you ever made a decision, this is in my job interview, where you put your reputation on the line? And I said, if you were to offer me this job and I were to take it, I would put my reputation on the line. So my reputation may be completely damaged. Anyway, I want to talk to you today about some of the work that I've been doing both inside and outside of the policy world. I thought it would be useful to start with a history of feminist economics contributions to public finance issues, to talk a little bit about some of the key insights that feminist economists and others, like the post-Keynesian economists, have contributed to the discussion of fiscal space and fiscal rules. I'll spend more time on fiscal policy, the two sides of fiscal policy, taxation and expenditure. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the kinds of tools that we think are important to understanding the importance of the ways that gender norms and relationships are both influenced by taxation and expenditure and in turn impacted by taxation and expenditure. So the two-way relationship that EPEC started with also applies to fiscal policy. And then I'll just mention a few ideas for research and policy uptake. In this presentation, I'm going to focus largely on low and low-middle income economies. While I started my career working on the US economy, for the last probably 20 years, I have worked particularly on countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, and they're quite different than the European economies we've heard about in this country. I'm going to, macroeconomic policy, as we all know, is really broad. Parts of what I'm going to say, if I was giving this talk differently, I would also talk about issues of debt, because they're so important to fiscal space and fiscal rules. I would talk a little bit about the interaction between monetary policy and fiscal policy, but I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to stay in my lane and focus on fiscal policy. And I have to say that I'm going to set this conversation, particularly some of the work I'll mention later on, in the context of the kinds of crises that are rising around the world. And one thing I am going to say right now, which I'll come back to later, is that many countries face fiscal pressures. And low-income countries in particular face a double whammy because they are now seeing reductions in development assistance. They are facing the tariffs that the US government and others is imposing upon them. And the room for maneuver is hard. So some of us have coined the next few years as the tax decade for development. It is about domestic resource mobilization. And that has serious challenges in low and middle income countries. So I thought I would introduce to you, and apologies for those of you who have seen it, a really great diagram that Diane Elson, my collaborator, has pointed out. I think you first did this at the Keith Griffin lecture or somewhere else, I don't remember where, about the various levels of fiscal policy. The macro level, where we look at aggregate levels of revenue and expenditure relative to GDP, so the tax GDP or the expenditure GDP ratio. We look at the behavior of fiscal policy over economic cycles, and in particular, the policy stance in many countries while there might be a dual objective of price of inflation and employment, often inflation gets the priority over employment objectives. There's the meso level of fiscal policy, which is the composition of revenue and expenditure and the balance between, for instance, on the revenue side, direct and indirect taxes, or the distribution of expenditure in terms of different sectors, for instance, the social sectors that EPEC described versus other sectors, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. Often overlooked in the literature is the importance of the administration of taxes and the delivery of services. And this is political economy and governance, but it has real world implications for the ways that people interact with the fiscal system. And there's a lot of gender issues that come up in terms of administration and capacity. And finally, it has to do with the level of government that's responsible for administration of revenue and expenditure. And India is a really good example here, where revenue is raised by the national government, but it's the state governments and the municipal governments that are responsible for expenditure. And usually subnational levels of government have very few instruments, revenue instruments at their disposal. They have property taxes or land taxes, but they're usually not the ones deciding on a value-added tax, for instance. Sometimes states can sometimes control sales taxes, but that's increasingly rare. And then there's the micro level of fiscal policy, which is the impact of revenue and expenditure on different social groups. And there's different ways to think about distribution. We think about it in terms of income quintiles or deciles, or some other welfare distribution like expenditure quintiles. But we have so much other things. Men and women are stratified by their race, their geography, other things. So figuring out the appropriate disaggregation, I think, is really important. And we look at the burden and incidence of taxation. I'll talk a lot about that because that's where some of my work is focused. And finally, we have the distribution of income transfers and benefits. So this is a slide that I'm going to apologize for. It gives, I have some peril at showing this because I'm going to apologize because it's incomplete, and I'm sure I've forgotten some of you in putting this on, putting your names on this. I forgot Alyssa, for instance, but I realized I forgot one thing. But the left is essentially to show you that feminist economists have written about fiscal space and fiscal policy, tax and expenditure for a very long time. And I wanted to remind us that at the macro level, Neela Farshad, who Diane mentioned, in her opening plenary, was one of the first to write a piece called Feminist Fiscal Policy, Gender Budgets and Beyond, which she did actually as an academic publication, but it had real-world implications at UNDP. I contributed with various collaborators at the meso level looking at gender and taxation. I wrote a book edited a book with Imran Valodia that had contributions from Sue and Jerome and Daniela Kasali from South Africa, Abena Oduro from Ghana. We had contributions from India. It was a book that looked at 7 countries at different levels of development with different types of regimes and economic structure, and we wanted to unpack how gender inequalities interacted with fiscal systems. And then, of course, Sue Himmelwhite has contributed a lot on the expenditure side. And there's been people who have been writing about the holistic approach. But the right-hand side, I didn't have enough room to put all of the authors in, has really exploded with research over the past 15 years, particularly with people, and I would cite here, looking at macro-level fiscal space, Stephanie Seguino, for one who I think is just an amazing thinker on macro-levels issues, Jayati Ghosh, who might be known to many of you, of course, Aslam, Ipek, Ajit, and collaborators at the Levy Institute, whose work I think is really important. You know, if I was to put other names up here, there would be a lot of neoclassical economists who have written about this. They're not necessarily feminist, but they do write about gender and expenditure and taxation. And I would love to have more names from the field of economics that I identify with more closely. So this is a plea. particularly for the students, to start to think about fiscal policy issues as you do your research. I was going to put this last, but Uslam convinced me to put this slide first. This book, this compendium that was mentioned, is coming out. We have 13 chapters. It's coming out for 3 chapters at a time for the month of October. We're going to launch it on November 12th. This has contributions by Uslam and Jem, Jerome, Ipek, and including some mainstream neoclassicals who are open to heterodox thinking. What we propose is a new paradigm for fiscal space and fiscal rules. It tries to bring forward a holistic approach that embeds gender equality objectives in fiscal policy through a holistic approach that connects taxation with expenditure. Often these things are examined in some of the literature in isolation or in silos, as opposed to this approach that really needs to understand the interaction. There are chapters that argue, as Ipek has done, for public investment in care services, but looks at the real world in country studies, Ghana, India, Albania, and Colombia, about whether we can have public investment in a universal care system and how countries actually struggle with doing that. And then we have a section on aligning domestic public resources with climate adaptation finance. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I think that's a really important emerging issue. Care has not yet been discussed here as an adaptation strategy for climate change. But if you think about the consequences of climate change, care can both help countries, households and communities to withstand some of the horrible effects and maybe become more resistant, but it's also a way of building resilience to future events. And we do some interesting work on trying to understand how finance can bring these two together. And then finally, focusing on the administration and technical capacity at the national and local level. And this deals at the policy side with attempts, I don't know how many of you are familiar with those attempts to bring gender budgeting and climate budgeting together, which in my view has a long way to go, but at least is a starting point. So let me just give you some highlights from the macro level literature that I think are really important to remind us, like where we're coming from, particularly in terms of trying to really redress some of the shortcomings of mainstream definitions of fiscal space, which are debt-focused, have a short-term time frame, focuses on countries' borrowing capacity, and public expenditure, which is viewed as discretionary, which Ipek, I think, if you didn't say that, you said current consumption, but as discretionary. Whereas I think the feminist and the political economy approaches, and also some of the development approach, goes beyond financial sustainability to include social and ecological sustainability, a much longer time frame, which, as Ipek pointed out, there is a mismatch between the short-term financial side and the longer-term returns. Looks at deficit financing. And on this side, on the deficit financing, I do want to shout out interesting new work by both Stephanie Seguino and Jayati Ghosh, particularly. She's got some really great work on debt and when it's appropriate for countries to borrow and how they can do so. And looking at issues of debt service right now at the expense of public investment, which is important. And I'm sure everybody here has heard the Oxfam and Action Aid talking points about more money in low-income countries, in many the most highly indebted countries in sub-Saharan Africa, going to debt service that is much larger than their education and their health budgets. So we really need a whole new rules of the game for debt reduction, debt cancellation, and controlling the financiers. So that's important. And finally, the macro policies and regulations that can expand fiscal space. So some examples from feminist economics. Ipek alluded to some of them. I'll talk about this more in the next slide, and some of our compendium chapters talk about this. Fiscal space is not a fixed or scarce envelope. It can be expanded and it can be reduced at the same time, and it's important to understand for when that happens. When it's aligned with social, economic, and environmental sustainability, good public investment can create a virtuous feedback loop that can expand fiscal space over time. And I think that's what we're really aiming to create. There's so much work on feminist economics on crises and austerity. There's a lot of attention in this literature to the ability of countries to use counter-cyclical policies, expansionary measures during times of downturns that can be consolidated in recoveries while protecting core social infrastructure and care spending so that the stabilization phase of post-crises is compatible with gender equality goals. And this, I said, fiscal space can be diminished or contracted when the failure to spend countercyclically worsens it. So it's really important to have well-timed countercyclical spending that can attenuate recession-driven squeezes. And I also think it's important, this is another point that comes from Stephanie Seguino, that mitigating hysteresis is also important. Countercyclical spending can protect labor productivity by limiting long-term unemployment and deprivation in the way that Diane also used it in terms of depletion of capabilities. And given women's roles in social reproduction, it also prevents long-lasting harm to children, which I think is really important in the longer term. Now, you can expand fiscal space through investment in the right type of infrastructure, as we talked about. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Physical infrastructure. The one point that I haven't heard coming up in this conference, which matters for the countries that I work in, is that investment in physical infrastructure is really important for women's unpaid work, because it's women's unpaid time that compensates for infrastructure deficit. So key infrastructures is transport, energy, water and sanitation, and the challenge for many low-income countries is to invest in that infrastructure in green ways and skipping the fossil fuel type pathway to a different pathway. But these things need appropriate design that actually pay attention to things like increases in access and safety and time savings. So you have to, while you're thinking about the macro picture, you need to think at the micro level of all the design issues that come into it. And then, of course, social infrastructure, which I'm not going to talk about, except to say that it's important, I fully agree with EPEC, to treat public investment in social infrastructure as investment in productive capital, because investment in social infrastructure raises the productive capacity of an economy. So I agree that we need to think through how, and it's a big challenge, we can think about how we do this, how we address this mismatch so that we can get the investment in social infrastructure, and how we can change a paradigm that this is productive. The returns are not tomorrow, but the returns are over some time frame. And finally, we can recognize we need to have a paradigm that recognizes the spillovers. So I want to turn now to the meso level, which is where some of the work that I have also been doing comes in. And on the fiscal side, besides the public investment that we've talked about of creating jobs, particularly, which are important in the short term, and capabilities in the long term, we need to think about other things we do on the expenditure side, which is expenditure switching. This is a political challenge. We need to redirect spending from low return, leakage-prone subsidies, and there's a lot of them in the countries that I work with, to set people like large landowners or to the mineral extraction sector towards higher multiplier physical and social infrastructure, because that would raise productivity, create decent jobs, and so forth. And we need to start, this is the alignment with the green economy, we need to start by phasing out fossil fuel extractive subsidies, which are large in many countries, and large landowner subsidies. And I think what's important about some of these sectors like minerals, these are import-intensive subsidies that actually leak out of the particular country, whereas in extractives and agribusiness, you have a leakage effect here. But if you could redirect expenditure to something that's much more tied to the domestic economy, you could expand fiscal space. So let's focus now on, so that was the expenditure side, and let's focus now on the tax side. There's been a long literature on gender and tax that I've been involved in since 2003, I guess. And most of it, I'm going to say this as a self-criticism, has been a limiting literature. And it's because there was no work basically on gender and tax when I started this, but we didn't know where to start. So we started by focusing on distribution, the distributional effects. And we had to start there, particularly with developing countries, because of data limitations, the lack of really good intra-household information from household surveys, the difficulty of acquiring administrative information on taxes, tax filers, taxpayers, or on beneficiaries of public programs. So we focused mostly on distributional effects, and we used a framework that turns out is highly unsatisfactory, which became known as the gender bias framework. And there were two types of biases: explicit biases, which are most commonly found in personal income tax systems. These are biases that are built into laws and regulations. The idea that married women may not be treated as a taxpayer in the same way as a married man. South Africa is a really good example of a country that had very explicit gender biases. Morocco, I don't know if anybody's here from Morocco, is an example where there's explicit biases today in the tax code because only married men are allowed deductions for a dependent spouse and up to 7 children. But married women, even if they're the sole earner in a household, cannot do that unless they go to a court of law and they can prove that they're the sole earner. So this changes the incidence of those taxes, with the incidence being higher for married women than for married men. So these kinds of explicit biases, these are antiquated, but we need to get rid of them, but they're still there. And then there were implicit biases, which are harder to detect, but those of you who know systems that are based on joint taxation, where you pool your income, and often in systems of joint taxation, you have primary income that has a certain set of rates, and secondary income usually has higher marginal rates. And those higher marginal rates are usually a labor force disincentive because it's women who own who earn that secondary income. So there's been quite a lot of work on this implicit bias, and there's still examples today of Germany and the United States. It's known as the marriage penalty tax. And this approach, though, while a good first step, it trapped us into looking at a very narrow set of issues. And with the rise more recently of the necessity to talk about how revenue needs to be raised by countries, we have decided that we have started to focus on a different approach that looks at domestic resource mobilization as a whole, connected to how decisions are made for how to spend it. So and this is an important conversation this year politically. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the UN Finance for Development agenda. There was a big conference that took place in Sevilla, Spain, a few months ago. And the biggest question is, how are countries going to raise money? What are they going to do in terms of their tax systems? So, and this is particularly important in low-income countries where the debate is really about what are the minimum, how can you raise revenue from different handles or instruments, and what's the minimum budget for a functioning government to provide a set of basic services. And on average, low-income countries collect just 14% of their GDP in tax compared to 38% in higher income countries. I'm simplifying this quite a bit. The higher income countries have debates about how to spend their money. Many of them have high tax to GDP ratios, but there are debates about the additional needs posed by things like the aging population and demographic changes, as well as the climate crises, for raising more revenue. I wanted to just point out here that I think feminist economists are very much aligned with others, like Joe Stiglitz, who you cited, and our friends at the Paris School of Economics, for proposing a progressive tax policy agenda. And we know these things technically are important. Progressive income tax systems have higher benefits for women because women are, because of the redistribution properties that they have. And women are generally, in many countries, poorer than men. So progressive systems play this important role. We know, and I'm not going to talk about it, but many corporations, businesses, multinational corporations are not taxed at the same rate as labor income. That's a very important tax handle, and there's a lot of work to be done there. Many low-income countries have very small personal income tax systems or corporate income tax as a share of total taxes. They rely more on consumption taxes, and there's big debates in the literature about how regressive VAT systems are. I tend to fall out on the point that we want to keep VAT as broad-based as possible, because you want to be able to fund things on the expenditure side that you can't really do with taxes. And I think that explicit bias framework got us into traps like saying, oh, countries should just exempt menstrual hygiene, apologies to the UK and some of this menstrual hygiene products from sales taxes. Well, no, they shouldn't, because they're often a subsidy to rich women as opposed to poor women. Usually it's the retailers who pocket the additional financing. You don't see price changes for low-income women. That's not a good idea. You'd rather raise as much money as possible and figure out how you're going to subsidize, on the expenditure side, different kinds of menstrual hygiene products for women and girls. I mentioned tax administration being important for tax policy reform. This needs a lot more attention, but we've done a lot of work to show how aggressive, in terms of enforcement, particularly of certain types of taxes, does fall differentially on women versus men. I've been involved in studies in Pakistan as well as Uganda, which shows that aggressive practices, sexual harassment, sexual violence, social stigma falls higher on women than men, and this affects compliance behavior. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but if there's in the conversation, we can talk more. At the micro level, because I know I only have a few minutes, I wanted to say there's a number of tools. What was that?
1 minute.
I heard 1 minute. There's a lot of tools for understanding both static as well as dynamic responses to fiscal policy. I often benefit incidence, when we started this work many years ago, benefit incidence was done separately than expenditure. This is for developing countries. This is not true in the EU, where we have tax benefit models that look at overall net distribution, but this hasn't been the case for many of the low-income countries. But I wanted to just say that I think the tool, and I'll come back to this, I've worked on a tool called the commitment to equity approach, which is a static incidence analysis, but there's also micro-simulation models, which I'll mention in the next slide, which looks at how much income distribution and poverty reduction is being accomplished through fiscal policy. So it takes you through the stage of different types of taxes and when you pay them and different types of public expenditure. And I like this approach because it both gives us the distribution, and the modeling can tell us about the behavioral effects. So one of the things, though, is that this particular tool is gender blind. So one of the things that I did is I worked with colleagues at Tulane University, Nora Lustig's group, to try to think about what would be a framework by which we can engender incidence analysis. And I'll show you an example of this in the next slide. Obviously, we think about sex disaggregating our variables, male and female income, male and female employment, et cetera. But we need to go beyond that. And I think the important thing is to explicitly bring in social reproduction and use time use data in incidence. I don't have time to go through how we do that, but I think it's a really important way to go. And I'll show you one example, if I can go for one more second on the next slide. But one of the things that I think is important is many developing countries don't have individual level data. Our data is at the household level. So how do you engenderize a household? I love what Ajit said yesterday and others who've been thinking about going beyond the representative agent. There's many ways to go beyond that we can think about households that have different typologies, that are gender type households, based on their earning status, their demographic characteristics. We can think about care in a fiscal incidence way by bringing in the household composition of children under 3 or adults over the age of 80, so you have a sense of what a care need of a household might be, and then what their claims are on the benefits side, or what they're paying, or what they're paying in terms of their taxes and so forth. So that's pretty interesting. But the most important thing that people forget is you need these household typologies that are nested within a pre-fisc and post-fisc welfare distribution, because you need the larger distributional issues as well as the horizontal analysis of different typologies. Behavioral modeling is really important now. You guys in Europe have a tax benefit module. It's Euromod, that is a tax benefit model for more than 20 EU countries. And UNU wider now has something called Tax Southmod and TaxMod. So we have a large number of these kinds of micro-simulation models. The issue for us for things like TaxMod and Southmod is missing data. Sex disaggregated data is just a perennial problem in many low-income and middle-income countries. So that's really important. I'm going to skip how you would bring gender into that and go to my last slide. We need better quality data, which is my fourth point there, that is joined up with analysis. But I want to just take 2 more seconds to talk about, not in detail, some of where I think we need to go. EPEC ended with this. We need to think about the politics of gender equality in the context of a fiscal system and what the fiscal stance then represents. And there's not enough analysis of that. So when we think about how the current backlash to gender equality that's occurring around the world might be affecting the expenditure side of the budget, or might be a constraint on different types of reforms on the revenue side towards a more progressive system. We need the alignment between development, public resources, and climate finance. We need more country case studies of actual fiscal systems from low and middle income countries. And finally, the last point that I want to end on, which you heard from EPEC and from me and from many of us in the room, we don't do research just to do research. We do research to influence policy and to try to make changes in the institutions that we're in and in the governments and the countries where we live and work. And so one of the things that I think is super important is figuring out the uptake of our research to improve tax equity, expenditure equity, and gender equality. So thank you.